Kia ora koutou tutahi mihi kia koutou whahara mai i te rane. Hei wharongo ki taru kōrero no reira mai ki ngā koutou kei ngā mana kei ngā reo. Kia ora tātou katoa. E George, tēnā koe ki whanau. Look, I just want to say it was a great session yesterday, and listening to the ideas that came up, it really reminded me of the journey that Te Papa went through, our National Museum. But look, we do want to say greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's a little bit tricky here because I'm going to select him. Can I also acknowledge the European Museums as part of the Switch Network, fellow colleagues. It's really my honour and privilege to be here to share some perspectives not only on the journey of a national museum, but also to share some thoughts on museums in general. Nicholas, host, Museum of Archaeology and College, tēnā koe. My name is Dr. Arapata Hakiwai, and I've been working at the National Museum in New Zealand for over 20 years. I'm the kaihautu. People will be asking, what's a kaihautu? A kaihautu is a Maori word which is taken, the symbol for that word is we have a canoe or waka, and the kaihautu is the person who gives call to the rowers so that we can all go in unison. I share the strategic leadership of Te Papa Tongarewa. I'll go into more detail there, but we have a very unique organisational structure at our National Museum. We have a chief executive and myself, along with 350 staff that share. So myself and our chief executive share strategic direction, along with our directors and underneath in different areas. So look, it's really my honour and privilege. I'm also the New Zealand's UNESCO Commissioner of Culture, and in that role I advocate strongly for the principles and values of UNESCO, but also as part of that is advocate strongly for the maintenance and the revitalisation of New Zealand's Indigenous cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible. Now look, I do want to say I accepted the invitation that was offered to me because I essentially love my language, I love my culture, and I want that to continue for my children, for their children, and those generations yet unborn into the future. I see museums as dynamic centres for reconciliation and healing, for social cohesion, for places that can help people and cultures maintain, develop and grow their culture now and into the future. I see museums playing an active role. Look, this conference is important in so many ways, not the least the political environment in which we operate, and the changes that are taking place throughout the world. I'd like to acknowledge the Switch Network and the 5-year Creative Europe project, sharing a world of inclusion, creativity and heritage. And I won't repeat these words, but look, they resonate strongly with me, and I think they resonate strongly with all of us here today. I want to congratulate and give my support for the aims of this conference with respect to taking these important museum issues from the realm of critique and reflection into that of action. And saying this, and I do want to acknowledge these words, we inhabit a time not only of global warming, but increasing political heat. Across Europe, battles over citizenship, belonging and culture are intensifying. Ethnographic and world cultural museums are in a contradictory situation. On the one hand, they are seen as bearers of appropriated heritage and unresolved colonial legacies. On the other, such museums are supported because they already connect or have the potential to connect diverse post-migrant communities, etc. To say we're at the crossroads is an understatement. Some years ago, the American Association of Museums, now the American Alliance of Museums, stated at one of their annual museum conferences that they were at the crossroads with respect to American museums and their relationship with First Nation peoples. Today, there are real challenges ahead of us. There is no doubt about that. The legacy of colonialism is real, and many museums have thousands of cultural treasures that remain connected to their source community, but distanced and alienated from it. In New Zealand, many Maori often view museums as colonial constructs, relics of colonialism and Western imperial expansion. Museums are facing enormous challenges to become more relevant and accessible, and to engage more fully with their source communities. Outdated and stifling museum practice continues to this day, perpetuating Western practices and conventions without any real interrogation or meaningful discussion or critique. And just at the Field Museum, I was involved in the restoration of a meeting house some years ago. And it was a very large meeting house, and for those that know the Field Museum in Chicago, they have the largest Maori collection in all the museums in America, 2,400 to be exact, including a large meeting house. I was involved in the restoration of that meeting house. I was involved in the senior leadership team called me, and they were wanting to establish a centre of cultural understanding, and they were intrigued with the relationship. And through the discussions that we had with the president and the senior leadership, they said, Arapata, we're intrigued with this native partnership. By own admission, we're rich in collections and forward relations. And right for the last 20 odd years, that's really struck a note in me, because I think it resounds strongly with many of the museums that we operate. We have thousands and thousands of treasures, but are we also rich in relations? Not actively involving our communities in the business of the museum appear to be the modus operandi of many museums. Museums are being challenged by their own fraternity and by the peoples and communities they serve. Some are meeting the challenges of our contemporary society, becoming more relevant, more engaged, and more receptive for issues that affect them in this global world. Others are content to remain the same. Museums must be more than passive repositories that hold vast collection of objects, of cultures and peoples throughout the world. The responsibilities and indeed obligations of museums with respect to the collections they hold require a new consciousness, a new paradigm, and a new way of thinking. And look, I just want to paraphrase here is that in the spirit of open debate and discussion, as part of that really is, and I'll share some of these things, but I'm trying to be as candid as I know how, based on the experience that our National Museum went through. This conference is very timely, and I'm glad to be able to share experiences that we've gone through. In this modern contemporary world, history, identity, and culture are increasingly becoming more important and vital. It is not surprising to me that the French President Macron, in more recent times, has been forceful and passionate about what museums have done, what museums haven't done, and what museums should be doing in the future. His statements, I believe, are long overdue, and I commend his courage and conviction. For us who care for and manage these cultural treasures, we need to critically reflect and look at ourselves and our museum practice. For me, this conference is about the latent transformative power and potential museums have with respect to the collections and knowledge they have and what they can do for their diverse source communities who have a continuing relationship with them. I've spoken at the Pacific Arts Association Europe meeting at this university 10 years ago, actually 12 years ago, as well as presenting the keynote address at the Exhibiting Polynesia, Past, Present and Future at the Te Kibron organised by Dr. Stephen Hooper, Pacific Encounters, Art and Divinity in Polynesia 1760-1860. At that symposium, we had a large Pacific Island contingent there presenting themselves and their culture with respect to the exhibition. I want to acknowledge the importance of that symposium because it signalled to everyone present that Maori and Pacific communities continue to remain attached and connected to their treasures. They also spoke of how they want to be active and involved in the telling of their histories and stories, both to themselves and to the world. In conferences I've spoken, I've shared Te Papa's unique bicultural foundation, along with our policies and practices. I have said that Te Papa was developed by the people, for the people, and our policies and practices affirm the importance of community engagement, community involvement, community participation, and community empowerment in everything we do. This remains to this day, and I'll talk about that briefly. My presentation today really focuses on two questions that was posed by Nicholas to me and part of the discussions leading up here. And I just wanted to, first question, we very much welcome your thoughts around what European museums have to offer communities and nations in the Pacific, and Maori specifically, and what kinds of partnerships and relationships and institutions such as Te Papa looks to take forward with museums in this part of the world. So now I'm just going to share a bit of history of our National Museum. Dare to dream, dare to challenge, dare to change. To understand the dramatic change and transformation that our National Museum went through is to understand the history that led to Te Papa's founding vision and concept. The Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarewa, or Te Papa for short, grew largely of what was happening in the 1980s as this was an important time in our history. The Treaty of Waitangi Act established the Waitangi Tribunal as a commission of inquiry to hear Māori grievances against the Crown concerning breaches of the treaty. From 1985, the Waitangi Tribunal was empowered to investigate historic grievances dating back to 1840. In 1985, the the Māori Language Act was passed in 1987. The Kohanga Reo National Trust for Early Māori Education is established, along with 2 Māori language nest programs. The first Māori University is established, and Te Karere Māori News program airs on television. There was a new and vibrant period of political rights for language and land rights. Te Papa had to dream and to reimagine it something far better than what it was. Te Papa reflected on its past history and challenged itself over and over again on what it was doing. It critiqued itself and pursued a pathway that it knew was unique in its Indigenous positioning and transformational with its community empowerment. During the 1980s, the National Museum was far from ideal. The building and collection storage were substandard. Māori taonga treasures were stored in appalling conditions. And although there did exist relationships with Māori, by and large, these weren't to any large extent. It was stifling, what I believe was stifling museology at its worst. The nation didn't want a blueprint of the old, and Māori certainly wanted something very different. And you'll hear that where former Prime Ministers of New Zealand said the same thing. As a museum commentator once said, there are over 400 museums in New Zealand, large and small, with a wide range and diversity, each with their own focus and direction. Museums have been the gatekeepers of culture and the control of Māori culture for a long time. They've played their part in the colonisation process in New Zealand, where they've collected and interpreted Māori cultural treasures without forming relationships with the iwi who had originally owned the collections. For many Māori, we have been the passive observers looking from the outside in. The language of definitions, the modus operandi and the management of taonga have been largely in the hands of the Western dominant culture perspective. Museums are in themselves cultural constructs reflecting the traditions and practices that gave rise to them. These traditions have remained with many museums in New Zealand since the time of the New Zealand Wars of the 1860s. And some examples will indicate that. Auckland was established in 1862, Taranaki Museum in 1865, Hawke's Bay 1865, our museum 1865, etc. Amidst this climate emerged the highly successful Te Māori exhibition that travelled to America in 1984 to 1987. The Te Māori exhibition was a defining moment for our nation. It took 10 years to put together, and there were 174 tribal taonga included in the exhibition. It went to these following 4 large museums. It opened at the Met on September the 10th, 1984, and closed exactly 3 years later at the Auckland City Art Gallery. Te Māori was a great collaboration and cooperation between museums, government agencies, sponsors, and Māori people. Te Māori was transformational, and it awoke the spirit of our ancestors in distant shores and stirred the imagination and minds of those working in museums. Its influence and legacy was profound. It changed the lives of people and museums. It involved our people in ways never before undertaken, and it said to the world, here are our people, here are our taonga, and we are its people. And I just want to repeat that. Here are our taonga, here are our treasures, and we are its people. The world saw the mana of our art traditions in the presence of our people and our rituals and tikanga, our customs. People saw that there was a living relationship between the taonga or treasures and their descendant kin communities. It was described as a journey and voyage of rediscovery, but we are natural navigators and explorers, and as such, Te Māori was a natural undertaking for us. Many commentators and writers describe the exhibition as a watershed moment that transformed our thinking and shook up the museum fraternity. It certainly did that and a lot more. Te Māori was the first real opportunity that Māori people had to manage and present their taonga in museums both nationally and internationally. The rituals and dawn ceremonies at the Te Māori venues awoke the spirit of our ancestors in distant shores and stirred the imagination and minds of those working in museums. In my understanding, it's the first time in the Metropolitan Museum of Art that the street was closed off to enable that to happen. The whakatauki or proverb used for Te Māori at the time goes, he toi whakairo, he mana tangata, and that translates as, where there is artistic excellence, there is human dignity. In a powerful way, it expresses the connections, relationships, or whakapapa, the genealogy of the cultural treasures with their descendants. It signalled to the world that these taonga treasures were an important part of the social universe of Māoridom, past and present. The research on the taonga in the Te Māori exhibition ensured that the appropriate tribes were consulted and liaised on all occasions. The research connected the taonga with the people, and this mobilised Māori people to recall and celebrate their histories, identities, and manawa taonga, our ancestors, and our way of life. Te Māori shook up our museum sector as it questioned museum-iwi relationships and issues around interpretation, governance, power and control. The Te Māori acknowledged cultural ownership. It put substance and affirmation to self-determination and recognised that Māori have every right to speak to their taonga and about their taonga, both to themselves and to the world. It said that these treasures are us and we are them. It touched many people in profound ways because we really hadn't experienced that before. For our government and nation, it said that we have a unique history and identity that we want to look after, promote and share to the world in our unique way. It said we want to be involved in that process and not passively from the outside in or let others tell our stories and our histories. The Te Māori exhibition highlighted the inadequacies of the museum community. The exhibition challenged those who managed and controlled our treasures in a highly visible way, highlighted the inadequacies of museum Māori relations, and in a way it said Te Māori was a turning point. No turning back, a time for museums to examine and change the way things are, the way they operate. This is why Te Papa was created. This is why our National Museum had to transform itself. This is why our nation wanted something far better than a museum that did little in the lives of our contemporary times. The success of this exhibition was the impetus for a new National Museum based on active community engagement, participation, and recognition of Māori Indigenous knowledge. The success of Te Māori provided the extra impetus and inspiration for the development of our National Museum. For those working in museums in New Zealand in the 1980s, it certainly was a time to reflect, critique, evaluate, and change. It said we had to be different. We had to be far more than a cold, impersonal, passive repository of treasures that did little to inspire, respect, trust, and confidence. 20 years ago, Te Papa opened with a singular vision to be different, to be a forum for the nation, to actively involve our communities, to have a bicultural partnership between Māori and other cultures through the Treaty of Waitangi, and to have a concept of the unified collections, to have narratives of culture. It had to be relevant, it had to engage its communities and publics in everything it did. The need for a new museum reflected changes in New Zealand society and the evolution of new attitudes towards our history and our identity. There was also a need for a museum that was more representative of New Zealand's culturally diverse society with broader audience appeal. It placed the visitor experience at the centre or at the core. The new museum had to honour the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, be biculturally based on the partnership between the true treaty partners. Some of these principles were partnership, protection, and participation. And we have Māori concepts which mean exactly the same: rangatiratanga, kaitiakitanga. People weren't going to the old museum. It didn't connect in any meaningful way to its communities, and clearly it was outdated, monocultural, and in need of change. The change and difference of this planned new museum was poignantly stated in many of the guiding documents. To provide a new opportunity to care for and look after Māori taonga was one example. There were 3 stakes put in the ground with regard to Te Papa's origins, that guided so much of the earlier institutional planning in the development phase. And look, it had to be for all New Zealanders, it had to tell our stories, and it had to be bicultural. To enable the reimagination and transformation of our new National Museum to take place, there had to be a platform of policies and practices. These needed to be shared, understood, and internalised in order for behaviours and practices to change. Having an aspiration to be a bicultural museum also meant creating an organisational structure that gave affirmation to that, I said before that I'm the kaihotu and that share the strategic leadership with the chief executive. Yesterday we heard from Laura, who mentioned yesterday that, different ways of knowing, different ways of being. We need to look at the structures and the processes of how we operate, how we learn, and that's exactly what we have done. And even at this time, we're going through that process right now. The Bicultural Museum arose from the need to be different, to be relevant, to actively involve Māori, and to be connected. It said that engaging Māori in all operations of a museum was critical and essential. A major initiative towards this bicultural museum was the creation of a marae and meeting house. There are museums throughout New Zealand that have meeting houses, but this was the first time that I'm aware that a meeting house was created through intention and not by inheritance. Perhaps the most telling symbolism of going from the old museum to the new was when tribal taonga, when carvings were carried from the old museum in Buckle Street to the new museum in Wellington's waterfront before Te Papa opened in 1998. Here we see the descendants of Ngāti Te Tākini of Te Arawa carrying the ancestral treasures carved storehouse from the old museum to the new museum. This also happened to many other tribal treasures. Roads were closed to allow this to happen. In a very poignant way, it was saying goodbye to how things were, and it was greeting the new museum and aspirations into the future. Since Te Papa opened, we have done many things with our communities. We have actively involved tribes in the telling of their histories and taonga to the world, and we have celebrated with our communities on projects that are meaningful to them, to Māori and our nation. The slides that you see show a new museum practice where we facilitate the interpretation and presentation of their tribal histories at Te Papa. We've had 8 iwi exhibitions since opening, and these iwi exhibitions have all been one of the most visible expressions of Te Papa's biculturalism. An important part of these tribal exhibitions is to present histories as they know it, as they see it, as they believe it to be. With all of these 8 tribal exhibitions, we have also made an undertaking to actively help those tribes in their future's imagination and their cultural heritage aspirations. And when I say that, we not only have a tribal exhibition for 2.5 years at Te Papa, we also have 2 tribal elders who share their knowledge and guide us in their rituals and during that time. And during that 2.5 years, we also worked with that tribe to see how we can help build their capacity, and help with their visions and their cultural heritage visions. And I think that's important because someone asked the question, a museum, where does it start, where does it finish? I suppose in that context, it's a museum with no walls. Although we date to 1865, our new National Museum opened in February 1998 in our capital on the Wellington waterfront. We are one of the most visited museums in all of Australasia, with visitation amounting to over 28 million visitors since we opened. Over the last 3 years, we've had annual visitation numbers of 1.5 million 2015-16 and 1.8 million in the last year. Te Papa's reach is further extended by a strong and growing digital presence. We had 2.97 million people to Te Papa's website in 2016-17, and 803,000 people see Te Papa content on Facebook every month. Our Indigenous Māori New Year Matariki celebrations attracts thousands to Te Papa, and during our Kaumātua Kapahaka, our senior Māori performing event, this set a live streaming record reaching 1.6 million people over the weekend, which it's one of those things I'm really heartened. It actually, many of the tribal websites operating outside of New Zealand broke down because they couldn't handle the load of the live stream, which is a fantastic position to be in. The evidence base that our National Museum wasn't fulfilling its role in society was pretty sound. Research into museums in Māori was carried out during Te Papa's formative years, and the results painted a picture of museum practice that didn't engage or partner with Māori. Many museums throughout the world put the emphasis and foci on the object or artifact separated and dissociated from the people and culture. Our National Museum was not good at serving the interests of Māori. The attraction of a bicultural museum was great, with a focus of people, culture and identity. The opportunity to embark on a new journey together meant that the stifling museum orthodoxy had to go. The new museum practice should connect and reconnect with the people and communities if they want a meaningful future. What has been the critical success factors for Te Papa? For me, it's about being connected, being relevant, and being of value to living cultures in today's contemporary world. An important dimension of this are relationships. Relationships have always been a critical success factor for us. Creating enduring relationships has been intentional as we want to work with Māori well into the future. In this day and age, we perhaps have forgotten the human factor, the cultural factor, the spiritual factor with respect to those precious treasures that are often spoken and defined as objects dislocated and distanced from their people. Museums have a profound responsibility to the people they serve, and they offer irreplaceable links to our past. The rethinking and reframing of museums is absolutely essential if what we say and what we do is to have any meaning and value for those communities we serve. Māori taonga are much more than aesthetic objects. They are living in every sense of the word. Māori taonga are intimately connected to Māori cultural identity and history because they form an important part of our genealogical connection process. Unfortunately, there are many taonga that Māori people did not know about. As a result of this displacement, these taonga have taken on new meanings and significance within strange environments outside those familiar to many Māori. We should not be constrained and restrained with what we perceive to be good museum practice based on the history of museology. We are all very familiar with the history of museums, why they were created, who created them, and the function and purposes they have served for many years. And we certainly are no exception. Museums, as we know, do many things. They are places of reflection, celebration, education, and encounter. Museums conserve and look after treasures of great antiquity, as well as presenting the rich dimensions of contemporary culture. They curate exhibitions and conduct research on them and the collections they house. But have museums been too complacent, too preoccupied with the way things have always been, too traditional, too orthodox, too inflexible to change, and too self-occupied, perhaps with pride and status? As cultures continue to evolve, develop, and grow in today's world, have museums also kept up with the pace of cultural change and development? In our modern world, for museums, there's a growing realization that there is a need to change to become more aligned to the communities they serve. I strongly suggest that museums need to connect or reconnect with the people and cultures whose treasures they possess. Our National Museum has been mandated by our New Zealand government with full support for Māori tribes to undertake the repatriation of Māori and Moriori ancestral remains since 2003. I have actively involved in many of these repatriations in many nations, and all of them are very significant and special. We have formed great relationships with many of you here at this conference, and I want to acknowledge all of you, Laura, Barbara, koutou katoa, who have been involved in the repatriation of our tipuna back home. Last year, we returned ancestors from Pitt Rivers, Oxford University, the Ubersee Museum in Bremen, the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, and the Manchester University. And we have in 2011, we returned Toi Moko from Rouen and other museums in France with the full support of the French government. When we welcomed the ancestors home from France, we had 7 members of the cabinet of the Senate who also travelled to New Zealand to be at that occasion. In 2014, this is the one here, we repatriated ancestors from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. In that particular case, discussions and negotiations had been going on for well over 100 years. In a few days' time, actually less than a day's time, we will be welcoming back ancestors from the Cologne Museum in Germany, from the De Young Museum in San Francisco, and from the Yale University in Connecticut. With respect to the return of Māori and Moriori ancestors, can I thank you all for your support in bringing our ancestors home. It does matter, and I know that Māori and our nation are very thankful for enabling that to happen. So now back to the 2 questions. What European museums have to offer community and nations of the Pacific? For me, the response to this is quite easy. For me, as I said, I love my language, I love my culture, I love my people, and I want that to continue now and into the future. You can help us to ensure that Māori culture continues to develop and grow into the future. Māori futures planning is intergenerational, and our past is an important dimension of our present and future. I want our present generation to experience and see the treasures of our ancestors, and I also want our generations yet unborn to have access to our taonga so that our culture can continue to flourish and grow. A few years ago, in a discussion with a Māori tribal group on their treaty settlements, Professor Linda Smith, who was the chief negotiator, and she also was the editor of Decolonising Methodologies, the book that the great book that Laura put up yesterday. And in our discussion, she says, she quoted, with regards to taonga, bits and pieces all over the place, making us whole again. Smith noted how tribal taonga was scattered throughout the world and located in museums and galleries through the process of colonisation, European expansionism and globalisation. Her plea was to have these taonga return to Ngāti Porou, to her tribe, as they belonged to the people and were important to their tribal history and identity. The language used in Ngāti Porou's cultural redress claim speaks about the enduring significance of these taonga to her tribe. The Museum of New Zealand has been described as a cultural leader and a museum that is different. Te Papa recognised the importance of taonga, of the importance that taonga play in the lives of its people. At Te Papa, we have identified that we must change, perpetuating the past and blindly following policies and principles that do little for the revitalisation and rejuvenation of Māori culture serves no meaningful purpose. In fact, it's a modern colonising process that further disenfranchises and alienates. If we put our communities and culture and identity at the centre, and perhaps as the organising principle, the changes in process and operation is manifestly different. Imagine a new paradigm and practice that transforms the object or artefact into a treasure that is imbued with all the qualities and dimensions of the culture that ultimately invested with meaning. To me, it's about alignment, connectivity, relevance, and value. There is an undeniable responsibility to have something far greater and meaningful to the living contemporary cultures than just accumulating and storing vast quantity of treasures. The question we need to ask is, what contemporary relevance are these treasures to contemporary cultures? Many argue the contemporary role of museums is to recognise the vitality of living cultures and be a platform for their future maintenance. And yesterday I noted the example from Stephen Weil with regards to transformational agency as being from a shift from being about something to being for somebody. With regards to the second question that Nicholas posed, there is no doubt that access is an important dimension. But what is a constant theme for many Māori in New Zealand, as well as museums in New Zealand, is that we want to create enduring relationships. It is about access, but it's a lot more. The statements by the French president must be applauded, as I believe he has rightly identified the responsibility of museums to actively assist in the living cultures, especially given the sad situation where peoples and cultures are poor in their connection with the ancestral treasures. Māori people want to create partnerships and relationships that can be mutually beneficial. Having access to reconnect to our cultural treasures will be uplifting to the mind and soul and help us to connect with our past and future. And I just want to... Taonga are not relegated to the historic past because of Māori people have an ongoing significance for their future. This meeting house here was taken by the Crown in 1867. It was stolen by the Crown in 1867. We've been... this is presently the tribal exhibition that is on display in Te Papa. It says a lot when you have such an immense and significant tribal taonga that was taken by the Crown. It's been in our National Museum for over 150 years. It has gone through the claim process. We no longer own that, and we have recognised that this great treasure was taken, and we're actively helping this tribe to return it to its home area. So from a confiscated taonga, dispossession to repossession, from darkness into light, from artefact into taonga or prized treasure, from despair to hope. Our New Zealand government have apologised for the taking of this meeting house, and our National Museum has also apologised. It ripped the heart and soul of the Rongo Whakaata tribal people, and as I said, over the last 150 years, it has been at our National Museum. In September last year, Te Hau ki Tūranga took centre stage as we welcomed their tribe into our National Museum as the 8th tribal exhibition. The difference now is that we are working in partnership with the Rongo Whakaata people. They are telling their histories and stories. We are actively helping the Rongo Whakaata to restore their meeting house in preparation for its journey home. As Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblet, as we all wear her quote, "For taonga, the issue is not a second life as an exhibit. What is at stake is the restoration of living links to taonga that never died." Presenting and representing Maori at Te Papa is about touching people's experience now and being relevant to Maori. It's about saying we can help you in your culture if we work together. And just to conclude, to sum up, we need to embrace the contemporary more in museums. This symposium is something we should do more as we come together to share experiences and help one another. We should listen more, open up our hearts and minds, open up our museums more, and involve the people and cultures more in the affair and business of our museum. And we heard many great examples of that yesterday. Māori people are reaffirming their cultural identity, and European museums can actively help us. In the same way that Te Papa dared to dream and reimagine a better future, and we need to show we have the courage to change. We can do a lot more, and we should. We should not be constrained with our own histories and what others might perceive us to be. We can make a real difference in the lives of people, and I believe we have a responsibility and obligation to do so. The transformation can be powerful, and I'd just like to finish with a very short video which showed the opening of this exhibition in front of their meeting house. So just sorry, I don't know how to do that.
Okay, that's fine.
There we go.
Right click. That's because it's still running. Right click.
It doesn't matter, but look, what the video showed was the emotion, the excitement of welcoming visitors to the opening of this tribal exhibition. And it was powerful in that it was the first time in 150 years that this tribe welcomed everyone to the National Museum to present their histories. Kia ora tātou.